They have two panels for us today, and then we're going to make available to you the opportunity for some Q&A. We also are looking forward to the other three webinars this fall. On the 9th of October, our subcommittee on housing, transportation, and connectivity. On October 27th, our subcommittee on sustainability. And on November 17th, our subcommittee on life sciences. So we announced yesterday by press release that on Monday, we will be releasing our first major report. We have a vision, Greg, myself, and our entire organizations, that you know what, we ought to be the first in the world to have a sustainable mega region where the economy flourishes, where we have quality of life, where we have affordability. So look forward to sharing that with you come Monday. You know, we find ourselves in some very troubling times. COVID, of course, the economic consequences that have grown out of that, racial equity issues in the United States, now wildfires. But I will tell you, nothing whatsoever is going to stop the relationship that we have in this corridor. We have a long and rich history, and it has made us unique. For not only are we able to work together to bring better results in the economy, but we also find ourselves able to solve some of the world's biggest problems. Well, one of the ways that we can do that is looking at our border and asking, how do we make it safe, secure, efficient, use technology, and use innovation? So that's how we're going to start today. It's going to be an exciting webinar. Can't thank our two co-chairs enough, and the whole team at Challenge Seattle and the Business Council of British Columbia. Greg and I are very, very interested in seeing what you all have to say to add to the dialogue in the future of our Cascadia Corridor. So with that, my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lori Troutman. She is the director of the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University in Bellingham. Lori is going to give us a little bit of update of where we are on the border and begin the process of our webinar today. With that, Dr. Troutman.
Thanks very much, Governor Gregoire, and it's great to see such a great list of friends and colleagues joining us. And as much as I love to see your friendly faces, we are asking people to turn off their cameras if they're not actively part of the panel discussion, and to mute your phones as well, and then we'll do some more active chat later on. So as Governor Gregoire mentioned, I'm going to give a very brief overview of what's been happening with the border and the virus in the Cascadia region. So I have a slide, if you can put that up, please. So as many of you know, on March 21st, the restrictions on all non-essential travel were put in place in a bilateral way in the land, marine, and rail modes between the US and Canada. Now, this does not apply to the air mode or to commercial traffic. And in addition, there is a 2-week quarantine requirement for all non-essential travelers entering Canada. So this graph gives you little context both on virus counts and on cross-border flows in the region. So that gray bar graph is the number of people entering the US or entering Washington state from British Columbia. And you can see that in March, those numbers dipped quite a bit. That wasn't just because the border restrictions were put in place. We actually saw people, much fewer people crossing. By about the end of February, the numbers started to trail off. So people were kind of self-regulating their travel behavior at that point. And the case counts you can see in blue are the Washington confirmed positive COVID cases, and in orange, those are the BC confirmed cases. Now you can see, obviously, there's a huge discrepancy. The numbers have been much higher in Washington than they have been in British Columbia. So this is an example of how the pandemic has played out differently on both sides of the border, both regionally and nationally. And that has, I think, shaped the ongoing nature of the border restrictions on non-essential travel, and will likely continue to do so. So I have one more slide, if you can bring that up, please. This is to give you a sense of the cross-border infrastructure in our region and the ways that British Columbia and Washington are tied together through our transportation networks. And it's really pretty robust. We have the Amtrak rail service out of Vancouver that goes all the way down to Portland, Oregon. We have 5 land border crossings, several of which are among the busiest along the US-Canadian border. And we have a number of marine connections between Vancouver Island and Washington State, both passenger and cargo ferries and cruise ships as well. And then, of course, flights that are not actually depicted on this, but that are moving quite a few people around typically. So last year, this cross-border infrastructure carried 16.5 million passengers from British Columbia to Washington State. This year, our projections are showing that that number is more likely going to be around 500,000. So while the land and air border is still operating to a certain degree, all marine and rail services have been suspended. And this has had devastating impacts on transportation and tourism, as well as some of those more rural communities that have been connected by that ferry, particularly on the Washington State side. Ferry operations alone bring over $100 million just to the city of Victoria. And then you add on the cruise ships, and that's millions and millions of dollars more. But of course, the impacts are not just about economics or infrastructure or transportation use. There's been a huge number of families that have been impacted in our region. You may have seen the media reports about couples getting married at Peace Arch Park, or families meeting up on either side of Zero Ave just so that they can see each other, even though they can't really physically be in the same space. So we really are finding creative and innovative ways to stay connected, and we're going to need to continue to do so, I think, for the foreseeable future. A lot of our communities that are adjacent to the border have been collaborating as these restrictions have been put in place. Here in Whatcom County, we have a local cross-border task force that's very active. We have great engagement from our congressional leaders, from the US and Canadian consulates, and we know that there's continual communication between Governor Inslee and Premier Horgan. So the Cascadia Innovation Corridor, I think, is perhaps, as Governor Gregoire mentioned, even more important now than before the pandemic and the border restrictions, because we do have to be more intentional and we do have to be more innovative to move forward and to move forward safely. So the members of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor Subcommittee have been advancing a number of projects during these restrictions. There's still a lot going on the border, and I'll just give you a couple examples very briefly. The high-speed rail project is currently in its third phase and is exploring governance framework options and financing as well. U.S. Customs and Border Protection is about to start testing out some electronic processing at Peace Arch Crossing for certain categories of travelers. And as that's being tested in our region, if it's successful, it will be rolled out to the rest of the Canada-US border. So that's really why the Cascadia Innovation Corridor is so important right now, to bring together these conversations, to maintain these cross-border relationships that have been built up over decades, so that we can recover from this crisis and we can come out the other side as a more resilient region, because we do share so many connections, whether that's family ties, cross-border infrastructure, economic dependence, or what I like to think of as our innovative and creative spirit. That really is quite unique to the Cascadia region. So with that, I'll transition to our first panel. And I want to start by saying that we're really, I think, entering a new era of border management. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in the US, we particularly made a shift to border policies that were aimed at integrating efficiency and security. So we had these sort of two goals that were front and center. We had programs like the Trusted Traveler Program, Nexus, that were created to dovetail these two goals and have been very successful. Well, now, in addition to that focus on security and efficiency, we have this third element that we're going to have to figure out how to integrate into border management, and that's public health. So people all over the world right now are exploring how we can do this across modes, air, land, and sea. And our discussion today is going to lay the groundwork for what technologies could be applied to restart international travel and what it's going to take to get there, obviously focusing on the Canada-US border specifically. So the central question we really hope to address today is, how can Cascadia help to address not only the immediate problems we're facing in our cross-border region, but also the longer-term need to innovate international travel, which has become a global challenge. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of work being done on this right now. Several of our speakers today, including myself, are part of a binational initiative known as the Future Borders Coalition, which has established a border recovery working group that's focusing on a lot of these issues. And you'll hear more about the Future Borders Coalition in the next panel. Our first panel today is primarily focused on technology and policy, and the second panel, moderated by Matt Morrison, takes a closer look at the future of air travel at YVR and at CTAC and this model of health pre-clearance. So I'm thrilled today to be joined by two of my very dear colleagues, Solomon Wong, the CEO of Intervistas Consulting, who's also very active with the Future Borders Coalition, and Dr. Chris Sands, who has So many titles, I can never keep track of them, but the simplest one is the director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Chris is based in Washington, D.C., and usually I would make some joke here about how it's a hot, sweltering day in D.C. and it's a beautiful, beautiful autumn day here in the Pacific Northwest, but unfortunately we're still getting choked by forest fire smoke. So I'll make that jab the next time I have the opportunity. So our first panel today will go for about 20 minutes. And we're going to begin with brief remarks by each of our panelists, followed by an open discussion, including questions submitted from you, the audience. So please use that chat box to submit some questions, and I will try to get to them either during our panel discussion or after the second panel when we'll have a more open Q&A with audience questions. So with that, I'm going to start with posing my first question to Chris. Chris, you live and work in the belly of the beast, Washington, D.C., and you have a very good pulse on the inner workings of the Canada-US relationship. What's going on between the US and Canada at that federal scale, and how does that shape what's happening at the border?
Well, thank you very much, Lori, and I really appreciate the chance to reconnect with your all of you in Cascadia. I was lucky to spend some time at Western Washington University, and I know how special a region it is. It's definitely the better Washington of the two, so put that out there. Because in this Washington, that is on the East Coast, we have a number of factors that are making it harder to see a way to move forward on the joint border restrictions. There's a kind of frozen border logic that's kicked in. For the Trump administration, a closed border reinforces his message of strong border security. For the Canadian government, concerns about the way that the US is managing the COVID crisis here have given a lot of support for Trudeau to keep the border shut so that there's not a contagion risk that comes across the border. That logic is compounded by the US election, which is a huge distraction. Congress is not doing much. You know, Congress hasn't approved a replacement for Kelly Craft, who left almost a year ago as ambassador in Ottawa. So we're operating shorthanded in Ottawa as well. And the personal relationship between Trudeau and Trump really doesn't include warm, chummy phone calls or the opportunity to chat. And so we're kind of in a moment where there's very little momentum at the federal level for adjusting border restrictions or even talking about adjusting border restrictions. But we've got a couple of key dates to keep in mind. First is January 20th, 2021, when we will inaugurate or re-inaugurate a president. Not much will happen between now and then, other than at least not at the federal diplomacy level, the national diplomacy level. And the second date to keep in mind is March 20th, 2021, which will be the 1-year anniversary of joint border restrictions. Putting that into a context, I think now is a great time to be having this conversation that we are having. This is because the federal scene is frozen. And if we continue to generate some new ideas, come up with some experiments, we have the time to be able to hit that anniversary when people are starting to focus again, or maybe a little sooner, and say, here, we have some ideas to help us move this forward when people are really ready to listen.
Thanks, Chris. Sorry, I had muted myself. So now we're going to have some remarks from Solomon, and Solomon's been involved with a lot of work that's focused on bringing technology to the border. So I'm going to turn it over to you to provide some background on those emerging technologies, why they are needed, and what the benefits and opportunities of those might be for the Cascadia cross-border region.
Thank you very much. And as the slides get loaded up as well, I think it's a great context to be able to look at the entire history of innovation as we go across the US-Canada border. I think we all need a reminder sometimes that a lot of things do cut across the borders, as we're choking in smoke equally in British Columbia as we are in Washington State. Certainly a lot of things that come across as things that we need to manage across both countries as well as the Cascadia region. So in the next slide, I've got a historical context. I think next year also becomes a fairly interesting year because of the dedication of the Peace Arch crossing and the monument that really exemplifies some of the opportunities we have in terms of what was meant by the folks that erected the monument across this land border and a great park in terms of a place that that people are keeping the human connections alive. But I also point to the backdrop of some of the things that are innate within the Cascadia region. On both the public and private sector groups within the region, we have some of the best innovators in the world in terms of border innovation. We may have started over 100 years ago with a one-size-fits-all, a pass-fail type of routine, but over time, we have adopted and put into practice a range of risk management measures. So when we were dealing with long lineups at the borders, it's being able to separate high unknown risk away from medium or low risk to be able to facilitate low risk legitimate trade and travel tourism. Now, as easing of border restrictions is still further away as far as just when that will take place, I think some of those principles of what led to the point where we had measures taken. So when you look at the PACE lane in terms of how that evolved in the 1990s in terms of a low risk product, this was very much supported by the business community and drivers ahead, as well as how we've evolved to different applications with the current version of Nexus, as well as the emerging areas of facial recognition and other types of applications that leverage smartphone devices. So key to this on the next slide is looking at the topic we're wrestling with in terms of the type of border threats that are being dealt with in terms of getting to a vision of a seamless, touchless processing that deals not only with our current focus on pandemic recovery, but against the range of border risks that are really facing our border agency friends. And I say friends just because I think, Chris, your comments are very well taken in terms of the federal side of things, but the glue that also binds together different regions are the agencies that are going to have that co-creation areas associated with a range of border threats, from identity management, customs, quarantine, ag, radiation, and other threats that have not yet been presented. So the resilience of the border in going into recovery mode is just how do we realign the people, process, technology, space requirements in order to get to a true risk model. So I point to 4 key transformation models. Number 1, eliminating steps. Many folks I've talked to, particularly dealing with emerging technologies, look at, well, what is the business case for being able to achieve border innovation? We may well be accelerating some of the things that are advancing as far as being able to deal with the aspects of what steps are absolutely essential. Leveraging mobile. 81% of the traveling public have smartphones in the Cascadia region. That's what the 81% is for on the label. Number 3, processing away from borders. Can we take advantage of some of the time available in order to do pre-processing? And 4th, event-based notifications, especially when we're dealing with healthcare management and information. How do you deal with the fact that you need a binational strategy on contact tracing to be lock and step with the easing of border restrictions, but also from a standpoint that you're dealing with events and discrete events. So there's some aspects in terms of groups like the Rockefeller Foundation or 3BP in terms of some of the kinds of ideas that are advancing in terms of app-based and information management. So on the next slide, we do have additional areas that are going to be key for the Cascadia region. And I think we need to look also at where do we hit above the kinds of ways that we're going to be able to take advantage of some of the innovations that are happening locally. So on the left-hand side, advanced risk management. Where does risk management evolve to going forward? AI, machine learning are key areas that are important to look at. But as are I'm sorry, we do have a little bit of echo from the line, if I can see if that carries on. But as I was saying, real-time data in terms of looking at the rate of infection. So RT values using an Oxford model or otherwise, being able to use that for decision enablers. And the focus on quantum computing also powering some of the areas of advanced algorithms to be able to deal with information that we're looking at as we cross the border, whether it's goods or people. Number two, leadership in digital privacy. So we're going through a period of time when biometrics, facial recognition, blockchain, or other kinds of solutions are really the focus of angst within the traveling public and people crossing borders. But we have an opportunity with the amount of development, especially the medical side of things, cutting across Seattle to Vancouver in terms of research and privacy. Privacy by design, some of the advances on medical imaging. And then as we get into a period of time of a vaccine is coming, but we also need to keep in mind that as you have a Russian version of the vaccine coming out next month, you also need to have track and trace to be able to get an equal language across health status. And lastly, there's never been a better time to get to alternate solutions models. So high definition video for Nexus enrollment is one idea that Future Borders Coalition is advancing, but there are other applications as well for video interviews that, just like we're doing on this particular webinar, there are opportunities to leverage some of those kinds of face-to-face contact through a device of some sort. But beyond that as well, if Malaysia was able to put together a blockchain-based solution so that university degrees can be vetted, there are solutions waiting to happen to be able to leverage the existing type of information, but also the kinds of efforts cutting across organizations. And lastly, pre-arrival readiness evaluation, a great advancement at Peace Bridge. There are opportunities also for being able to use that type of approach to do pre-processing, and the digital travel credential in terms of the next version of the passport. There are solutions that could be programmed and put into practice in terms of pilot projects. Back to you, Lori.
Thank you, Solomon. That was fantastic. And Chris Sands is going to jump right in, I think, with a comment following your remarks.
Yes, actually, Solomon, you're always inspiring. What I wanted to do was to emphasize another layer of the testing, as I think from a policy point of view, what we're going to need to do is anticipate different scenarios in which we find ourselves moving. And just briefly, one scenario could be that we do have a vaccine, and then we have the challenge first of joint testing. Now, the US and Canada do test pharmaceutical drugs together as a highly collaborative process, so that's our advantage. On the other hand, joint production. We haven't explored it. Canada has significant pharmaceutical productive capacity, but because of wars over IP, the US and Canadian production companies don't get along. So that's something we can work on from a policy point of view so that when we do have a vaccine, we can maximize getting that vaccine out to the public. If we don't do that, we could find ourselves seeing people trying to cross the border to get vaccine from the other side, a very negative scenario we'd like to avoid. A second dimension is that the border restrictions start coming apart for essentially economic reasons. It could be court-driven. We saw the court decision in Pennsylvania just yesterday that started looking at whether the economic lockdowns were constitutional in the United States. You could see that having a cascade effect, especially if the Supreme Court gets involved, that would suddenly invalidate restrictions and take away an important policy tool that has helped us to combat the pandemic. It could also be a political upsurge. The Congressional Northern Border Caucus has been talking about needing some kind of break in order to support small and medium-sized enterprises, tourism, cross-border shopping. Those pressures can't be kept bottled up forever, and you'll start to see people pushing for change. So an economy opening scenario that complicates operating a test or even operating a solution across the border has to be factored in. And then maybe the third, which is a hybrid scenario that has a little bit of the two. And this is where I think technology could be particularly helpful. First, phasing the restrictions out and creating data points at which we move to the next phase would provide not only predictability for business, but with the right technology, it would provide a sequencing for improving as we move forward. Secondly, trusted, healthy travelers. We have lots of trusted traveler programs. If we could find a way to incorporate public health data, maybe like Trusted Traveler, on a voluntary basis initially to avoid a privacy concern in either country, to give people some agency in all this so they can begin to say, it's not whether I'm essential or not. I have a purpose. I'm taking those steps to be safe, and I need to be able to move. I think anticipating that, it would be a very useful way of thinking how the technology could apply and help us move to another level. And just a last observation, the US has devolved a lot of responsibility onto the states, as Governor will know, and that's allowed for a lot of variation for good and bad in the United States. In Canada, federalism was worked slightly differently with better cooperation between feds and provinces. Both of those have some opportunities to create interesting patterns and experimentation. And it's one of the reasons I think regional variation, the idea that we might have a border solution or bubble for the Pacific Northwest that is different than what we do in the Midwest, has to start being contemplated. We've gotten back into the one-size-fits-all mentality a little bit at the policy side. We need to give policymakers the tools to feel confident that regional variation makes sense. And just to defend this idea, when the federal government's decided to allow commercial traffic to proceed as essential without health screening truck drivers, important note, we were essentially creating an option that works really well for the automotive industry and the industrial Midwest, but not for the Pacific Northwest. So it's false to say we can't have variation. We already do, but we have to make it variation that works for people. And that's not been the case in the Pacific Northwest. So just some considerations there, because I think building on what you had to say, we can do this, but we have to be conscious of the policy context as well as the tech.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And actually, it draws on a question that has been submitted by a couple of people in the chat box, which is, what are your thoughts on the possibilities for creating some sort of regional bubble or air bridge model? I think early on in the days of the restriction, many of us thought, that could be possible, but then we think, no, the border is federal jurisdiction, and it wasn't clear with the Department of Homeland Security if it was possible to have these sorts of regional or geographical exemptions. We've seen with the case of Point Roberts that it's really hard to get traction or movement on any sort of modifications right now. So this maybe is a more theoretical question that relates even more to the protocols that would have to be in place. But Solomon, what are your thoughts on regional kind of air bubble or travel bubble model?
Well, I think from that standpoint, the state of Alaska adopted a model similar to many jurisdictions. There are 65 in total around the world that have advanced ahead a testing environment to be able to have a certified test, and that is really one layer of adding to the mix, because if there were a silver bullet to be able to have proof positive in terms of stopping transmission, that's something that would be wishful thinking in terms of what the science and technology has demonstrated. So I think the key to a regional type of approach is really one where you have different layers in terms of risk management. You're dealing with limited resources, yes, but I think the other point, just to dovetail on Chris's observation, is you very much need the private sector to really be at the table in terms of finding the solution. So whether that is a supply chain or a multinational that already has corporate health and security measures taken internally, I think finding that win-win type of environment to not have a black and white binary type approach, but the shades of gray, that really is the challenge for over 30 years of moving ahead a risk management model between US and Canada for the border that really is informative to how do you actually make sure you still have a binational economy that thrives, while at the same time allowing enterprises or sectors to
Well, and Lori, to pick up on Solomon's point, I think we've seen a couple of bubbles successfully. There's an Australia bubble with New Zealand that's allowed travel. We also have the bubble in the Maritimes between New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. And there are a couple of features that have characterized those. One is an agreement on a test. Second, an agreement to share the results of that test so that you can act on them. We spent a lot of time with a particular kind of cargo screening. Some of the the guests on the in the audience today will know that for a while we had a serious problem with screening cargo or baggage at airports. And in part, it was because the US and Canada disagreed on the machinery with which to screen suitcases and hand luggage. And so it forced people to actually pick up their bag and take it with them to re-enter the US or re-enter Canada. It was a big hassle. The quicker we can get to a converged standard, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, but to say, you know, we really need to be able to agree on something as just a workable solution for now, maybe not the final answer. I think that's something we ought to be fostering as well.
So Solomon's back. That's good because we lost him briefly. But I want to kind of pull on this concept of the subnational government and bring it back to Cascadia, which is, we have just about 5 minutes left, and talk a little bit about how does Cascadia participate in that kind of active advocacy and technological thrust, and what does that actually look like?
So I think in the Cascadia region, I think being able to put together pilot projects between organizations that are being able to invest in technologies associated with people, process, or different steps, those are aspects that historically have given rise to programs like the Pace Lane that grew into Nexus, border automation in terms of the kiosk products that YVR led the charge on, as well as, let's look beyond that. I also have to give a shout out to Portland as well. Portland 20 years ago was the first place that put together self baggage screening in terms of a model at the airport. The other aspect as well that few acknowledge is Alaska Airlines, and I think Alaska's on the call, were 25 years ago put together the first text message check-in type of application. So there are things that we know the ideas are here throughout the region. Being able to advance, first of all, the idea generation. Second is there's an established set of networks in terms of partnerships across governments. So the in spite of the political side doing what it's doing during this political silly season we're in, we know the relationship between agencies has never been stronger in terms of the huge investments in human linkages. So finding a way of scaling that upwards, we all have a strong history of ideas that came from the Seattle field office for US Customs becoming the Rome app for pleasure boaters so that you could do a video interview. So it may be just low-hanging fruit, like taking that idea and populating it for other modes. And let's not forget goods movement as well, just because the imperative around supply chain and critical supply chain management is so important. The World Health Organization has estimated that 50% of vaccines go to spoilage because of insufficient cold chain storage. That may not be as high of numbers in our geography, but the complexity that Chris described is really one where if you're going to need that flexibility of production across different geographies, I think that conversation and agreement on principles has to be anchored down shortly, and then moving into the actual use cases that will produce benefits in the short term. Testing things out, we went through a period of pilot project fatigue, but now's the time to gather the empirical evidence around some of the ideas that will be ingredients for future models that will be a constant set of optimization in the coming years so that we get to a mold where the new normal settles in.
I like to use the new abnormal. That's what I've been saying lately. Chris, we're kind of over by a minute, but if you have something really short you want to throw in?
Sure. Just to say one thing, I think the worst contribution that Washington, D.C. has made to this whole COVID response is making it partisan. A lot of people can't really look at the evidence because they're too mad at Donald Trump or too mad at the Democrats. It really is counterproductive. And I think if there's one thing the Pacific Northwest, the Cascadia region has always been, is a region where people talk to each other as human beings, that close contact, and you don't have that discourse. So we should move forward on the basis of evidence-based policymaking, show people that it works, leave the ideology and the partisanship at the door. I think Canada's done that better domestically than the US has. And it's a pox in everybody's houses. I'm not taking sides. I just think this needs to be solved with science and not politics. But because we're dealing with policy, the politics will come in. We just need a different kind of politics. That's the new normal I would like to get us to, but maybe not until after the election.
Great, thank you both. We'll come back during the audience Q&A and talk about these things more. And I had a comment that was submitted previously from Destination Greater Victoria and their Tourism Rescue and Recovery Task Force. But rather than pose it as a question to this panel, I'm going to use it as a transition to the next panel. So they have great concern that the biosecurity and health measures required to open the border remain undefined by both the US and Canada. Moving forward, while the border is closed, industry is losing valuable collaboration time to work with government to innovate and start building a long-term health resiliency into the travel and tourism sector. So this concept that we have this sort of time right now, there's a bit of a void and there's so much work to be done, and it really needs to be done. I think we all agree the restrictions are important, but we still need a plan in place to eventually move beyond them. So the next panel is going to speak about some of the recommendations that have been made to both governments to construct this layered health-paced approach to eventually somewhere down the line easing those restrictions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt Morrison, the CEO of the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. He's also my co-chair for the Cascadia Innovation Corridor Subcommittee on Borders, and he'll take it away with the next panel.
Thank you so much, Lori. This is great beginning for a great panel that we're planning to have. If I could have the next slide, before I introduce my panelists, I just want to give a little bit of history for those of you on the line. The Future Borders Coalition established a set of principles and sent them to both Minister Chrystia Freeland in Canada and Chad Wolf, the director of DHS, back in July. And as we saw every 30 days, the border closure extended, we wanted to ask for a principle-based approach. Number one, that it would be binational coordinated approach. Two, that we'd have a layered risk-based approach whenever entry requirements are reviewed by border authorities. And we'll be talking about that during our panel. And we also called for the implementation of a phased approach informed by science and easy to understand criteria for the public. And along with that, a joint task force supported by a panel of experts and an advisory committee with public and private entities to work on that phased approach, data-based guidelines. And then a continuous assessment of the economic impact resulting from the extension of these border closures. So we are continuing to seek support for these principles, both in the US and in Canada. And our panel is going to be looking at the air travel, the air mode, and I'm delighted to have a fantastic panel of friends. Jerry Bruno is the co-chair of or the executive director of the Future Borders Coalition, and really the founding impetus behind the Future Borders Coalition. He spent a lifetime working on air travel and border processes. He's the past chair of the Canadian Airports Council Facilitation Committee, and he's very well known in Washington, DC, and in Ottawa. And really happy to have Jerry with us on the panel. I also have Julie Collins, who is the director of the Seattle Customs Experience and Brand Strategy for SeaTac Airport. She has established the first customer service department in 2018 and launched the airport's first standalone brand with an emphasis on elevating customer experience at the Seattle airport. It's very exciting to me that we have had a series of meetings with YVR and SeaTac in really looking at how we can collaborate on this really crisis in terms of air travel. So with that, we can take away this slide and put up Jerry's, and let me turn it over to Jerry to start, and then we'll be followed by Julie. And again, feel free to type questions into the chat room. And if you're not a speaker, feel free to turn off your camera. Thanks so much. Jerry, back to you.
Well, thank you, Matt. Pleasure to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to update the Cascadia Innovation Corridor on our Future Borders Coalition. Next slide. I think a lot of you are already aware of the work that we did when we were called the Beyond Preclearance Coalition. We've been active for about 2.5 years. We recently incorporated and rebranded as the Future Borders Coalition. As Matt mentioned, he is the co-chair of the board now for our organization, and I'm serving as the Canadian co-chair as well as executive director. We are now a multimodal coalition with over 60 binational member organizations from airports, airlines, railroads, chambers of commerce, tourism organizations, universities, think tanks, including Woodrow Wilson Center and others. We did publish a white paper in 2018. Solomon Wong and his team at InterVistas wrote it on behalf of our coalition. We held a couple of summits where we launched 10 working groups, one in Vancouver in 2018, and then a big transportation border summit in Washington, D.C. In April of last year. Given the state that we find ourselves in with this COVID nightmare, the focus of our coalition has shifted from working groups to deal with capacity and efficiency at the border to border recovery. What do we do to what measures can we take to get the border moving again in a safe manner? Next slide, please. So one of the things we've done, our board is really now the Border Recovery Working Group, and we have under this working group 4 task forces, an Air Border Recovery Task Force. I'm co-chairing that with Matt Cornelius from Airports Council International. We have Mike McNanny from the National Airline Council of Canada as a vice chair, and Barb Kostuk from Airlines for America. We also have a land border travel recovery task force that our very own Lori Troutman co-chairs with Jennifer Fox from NASCO. We've also got supply chain goods movement task force co-chaired by BNSF and UPS, and we've just launched a maritime border task force that Cruise Line International Association is leading. Communications working group was already established, and we're keeping that one going, as well as our applied policy research working group. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about the where we're at with the Air Border Task Force, in particular, the centerpiece of our initiative is really centered on the health preclearance pilot project. This diagram just illustrates the type of flow we're talking about. We're looking at a layered testing process, similar with what we've done with aviation security. So the idea would be that a traveler would get a 72-hour COVID test, 72 hours in advance of travel. A second test, a rapid antigen test, on arrival at the airport before being allowed to enter the terminal. Down the road with immunity passports, those passengers could bypass that process. So the intent is to create a biosafe zone within an airport terminal context. We've already taken a lot of measures, as you'll hear from Julie from CTAC, and YVR has done very similar things in terms of hygiene, We're looking at automated processes, facial verification, etc., touchless processes, with the intent that we can scale back on social distancing and masks, etc., and go back to a more normal type of operation. And with what the airlines are doing, we've been told that terminals, airport terminals, and airplanes are actually safe. It's the travelers that haven't been screened that are the problem. And hopefully with these measures, we could eliminate the 14-day quarantine requirements that Canada has in place. So we are talking about a pilot project, several actually. We are in discussions with CTAC, as Matt mentioned. Maybe looking at, there was always a lot of travel between Microsoft and Amazon representatives between Vancouver and Seattle. Could we do a test pilot with them on a volunteer basis and provide data? And that's a missing link right now for our health authorities, is information. How do we make sure that people coming in are safe? Will this testing concept work? We've also announced that we're going to work on a pilot at Vancouver Airport with WestJet to do a departures testing model approach. And even yesterday, the Airlines for America has also called on the federal government to help with eliminating quarantine and by applying adequate testing. If we go down this path, the beauty of it is it will allow air travel to resume. As I've said to our Deputy Minister of Health in BC, I can't solve your party animal problem, which with community spread, but we can certainly help solve the air travel problem. We can make ourselves a key part of the solution rather than being tainted as part of the problem, which is bringing in COVID infected passengers, if you will. So that's it in a nutshell what we're trying to do. We think if this process is successful, we can apply it to other modes. We could apply it to cruise ships, for example. We could apply it at a train station for cross-border travel. Next slide is just a list of contact people, myself, email, and phone numbers. This, I'm sure, will be made available. Matt Morrison, of course, Alana Lawrence, who's our executive director, and Solomon Wong and his team at InterVistas, who are providing program management support. We have our website listed if you want any information, anyone interested in participating, joining our coalition and being part of our task forces, you're more than welcome. So that's it for me, and happy to answer questions. You're on mute, Matt.
Can you give us a little rundown on the data or the statistics of how far down we are in terms of air travel from a year ago?
Well, it varies, I think, by airport and region. But just to give you an example, for YVR, we're down about 90%. I mean, we look at the month of August where we used to have 80 to 85,000 passengers a day, and we barely made 10,000 passengers a day. So really significant. I think the U.S. has got a bit more domestic travelers, so they haven't gone down as deep. But globally, hundreds of billions of dollars in losses for the airline and airport industry and the associated tourism industry that depends on air travel. So we're probably one of the hardest hit sectors when you combine tourism, airports, airlines, and other modes of travel.
Thank you, Jerry. We'll come back to you, but let me go to Julie and ask the same question. How are things at CTAC, and how are they different from a year ago? And how does this impact the Puget Sound and Washington State economy?
Sure.
After all, we're the headquarters for Boeing, Alaska Airlines, major hub for Delta, et cetera. Julie, thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt. And maybe if we go ahead and go to my slides, that'll cover some of those questions that you've just asked.
Okay.
So again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to join along with YVR in thinking about how do we as airports approach this pandemic and restoring our customers' confidence in air travel. Next slide, please. This gives you a snapshot of your economic question, Matt, why it matters. For the Port of Seattle, as we look at both our maritime trade and our impact from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, it is significant, both the jobs and the economic activity. And so we know that bringing air travel back to a robust state is a huge priority for our region. Next slide, please. So to give you that context, the word unprecedented, I think we're all so tired of that word. And yet when we look at it from an airport perspective and look at some of the major impacts over the last 20 years in the airline industry and airport industry, this one surpasses them all. And so in 2019, having a total of 51.8 million passengers down to, we hope, about 20 for this year, it's a dramatic change. And again, just gives you that context about the challenge that we're facing. Next slide, please. And so as we recognized in April that we were really in a very, very difficult situation that was going to take a long time to dig out of, we realized that we needed to really, across the airport, bring together our best efforts, our best input to really form what we call Fly Healthy at SCA, a very focused program. And again, that restoration of confidence in air travel, it really comes from people feeling safe. And so I'll talk a little bit more about some of those steps that we've been taking. Next slide, please. And so to your question, Matt, about some of our volumes, in April, which we hope will be the low, 2,500 passengers a day, incredibly down to 95%. And so in August, we have seen some steadily improving uptick in our passengers. We actually did finally cross that 20,000 passenger a day threshold over Labor Day weekend. But again, that is still down 75% compared to this time a year ago. So it is better than April, but certainly a long journey ahead. And we know just historically that as kids, as schools start up again, we will see a dip in September. Here's some other stats as well, just to give the audience a little bit of a sense of some of the other ways that we're looking at our operations, our daily aircraft operations. And air cargo has not been as affected. Obviously, those packages coming to our homes are driving that air cargo number. We did see at the very beginning of the pandemic a huge hit on our airport dining and retail. Those businesses are still struggling, but we do have now 85% of them reopen. And so that's an encouraging sign and helps our passengers. And as we go to the next slide, the picture of the mother and her child here, it's sort of that touchstone for me about it really is, how do you make people feel comfortable? And if a parent feels comfortable bringing their baby, I feel like that's a really strong sign. And so I keep them in my mind about the work that we're trying to do here. This, again, gives you a little bit more of a snapshot of North American airports. You'll see, unfortunately, at the far end on the right are our Canadian airport brother, sister airports, and we're about in the middle SCA for the domestic airports here in the US, a little bit at the higher end, but still far down from where we were a year ago. Next slide, please. So as we've talked a lot, I think after the word unprecedented, multi-layered is the word that gets used the most, because we know it's not just any one thing that will restore confidence. And so our initial focus has been on that airport experience, making sure that our cleaning is enhanced, that we have barriers. You'll see those plexiglass barriers like you see in other places, signs, decals all over the airport. Face coverings, I do want to just touch on face coverings and hand sanitizers. As we survey our customers, overwhelmingly, the importance of seeing hand sanitizers and people seeing face coverings over and over and over again is imperative. And so we've put a lot of effort, not only requiring them, but really reinforcing people wearing face coverings. Our customer feedback is that is a real point of anxiety when they don't see people wearing face coverings. Next slide, please. And so as we think now and into the future, some of the things that we're really focused on, in addition to enhancing and adding more cleaning, what are some new tools that we can be utilizing? And so this, what's called a Casper unit on the left side, it's a mobile system. It removes pathogens from the air, try to enhance on top of our already good filtration system, other tools. The health screenings, we did over the summer 2 proofs of concept, temperature checks where we had 10,000 passengers who voluntarily had those customer temperature checks. We did not see any elevated temperatures of those 10,000 customers. We do know, of course, that from an optics standpoint, a customer confidence standpoint, seeing something like this is comforting to passengers, but again, was not a tool that did produce elevated temperatures. What we are now pivoting and thinking more about, and it really kind of lends to the pre-clearance concept that Jerry was touching on, is around COVID-19 and around rapid testing and what kinds of services we might be able to provide here at the airport. And so that is an area that we are currently very focused on. Touchless technology, this is one of our common ticket carrier kiosks, and changing that software so that a person who has checked in remotely could hold up their phone and be able to print their baggage tag and not touch that kiosk. And then finally, best practices. And this again is really what's driving our interest in working more closely with Penwar, working with YVR, and frankly, working with airports around the world. We're very fortunate. Airports are a very gracious industry. They share best practices. They talk about what's working, what's not working. And I think especially in this time of a pandemic, being able to come together with that airport community and really think about how do we utilize those things which are working best across our industry. We're mindful too that as airport to airport, as that experience is different, that does not bring about people's confidence as much as knowing with certainty when I go in an airport, this is what it will be like. And so that's a challenge right now that we need to continue to, as an industry, work together and really improve upon. Next slide, please. And then finally, we want to be very transparent, of course, with our public, and making sure that not only with our public, but internally, that we have a roadmap. And this is a bit of that putting your blueprint together as you're already building the house. It has been such a condensed process, and we did put together an action plan that is, we call it our first edition because we know it will need to continue to get updated over time as we learn more, as we understand more. And so this is on our Fly SEA, and just wanted to make that, make the group aware of that. And that's my last slide. We'll go ahead and go to that, and I look forward to the discussion period. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thank you very much, Julie. I wanted to ask both of you, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. To describe a little bit about the history of working together, your health committees have had several meetings, and what is the position of the airlines that are your tenants? How are you engaging the airlines in this whole discussion?
Sure.
Go ahead, Julie.
Go ahead.
Sure. one of the things, Matt, that we've recognized is even though we've always had, I'll call it good informal conversations, whether it's with YVR, whether it's with our airlines, that the need to be more intentional and really focused on that is very important. And so with our airlines and frankly, our stakeholders across the airport, we are meeting every 3 to 4 weeks. Certainly conversations in between, but bringing that large group together to make sure that we're sharing information, best practices, et cetera. And so with YVR and with Penwar, I really appreciate the overture that that you made to really bring more discipline around our conversations together as well. And so we have been meeting every couple of weeks. We are, I think you're going to talk a little bit more about this, Matt, pursuing a grant that would help us do some joint peer review and best practices work. And so we just know this is a time where we're really sharing information is imperative.
Jerry?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, on the Canadian side, we've got working groups with our airline partners, Air Canada, WestJet, Air Transat, and others, as well as our airport colleagues. We meet regularly. We're also part of the Airports Council International Group. I actually gave a presentation to the Joint Policy Council last week. For Canada and U.S. Airport CEOs on our Future Borders coalition and initiative. So we're all in this together. We're so dependent on each other, and as I've been telling our federal government, you know, if airlines aren't flying, airports don't have a business. You know, we're tied at the joined at the hip, and we are working very closely together.
Jerry, could you share with our audience a little bit about the situation with short-term testing and where Canada is on FDA type approvals?
Yeah, they're probably further behind than the FDA is from what we've seen on the rapid testing approach. There has been one that has been approved, the Spartan Technology one. It's close to an hour in terms of response time. The concern for us with that one is it's not scalable. We've been watching closely the Yale University Saliva Direct, which holds a lot of promise. It's quick, it's inexpensive, etc. We're also in discussions around using pool testing, which allows us to multiply how many tests can be done in sort of one test, because lab capacity is one of the major constraints.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. And as Julie mentioned, we are in the process of applying for a grant to the US EDA to do a scoping project for SeaTac Airport to look at how we address this, because it's not, you know, in the short term and the medium term. As Julie said, the science continuously changes, and we have to be ready all the way to the vaccine and how we do health verification. So I'm very hopeful that in the next couple of weeks we'll be able to form an advisory group with airport officials, as well as connecting with YVR and airlines and the entire air community to look at how do we do this. Julie, any final thoughts before we turn to questions?
No, Matt, I just, again, I think that this partnership theme is part of what is essential as we move forward. You know, unprecedented times. And I think your comment about the evolution of health information and the medical information is such a big piece of this, where in May, the thought of taking temperatures at the airport made a lot of sense because that was such a strong indicator. By August, a lot of questions, still a really important thing to do, but then there are other types of evolutions, rapid tests, et cetera, that maybe need to be added. So it's fast moving and fast changing. And that's again where bringing in academics, bringing in private sector industry, it certainly is not something an airport can do alone. And though we are always thinking about safety, it's a different kind of health, if you will, types of issues that have not been as common for airports to do on a daily basis. So it's been an interesting evolution.
Great points. Jerry?
I noticed there were some questions. One was regarding why isn't Mexico included in our Future Borders Coalition? And just to give you some background, initially when we set it up, what we were trying to do was reactivate the Canada-US Beyond the Border Action Plan. This had been in place for 5 years. It led to the new pre-clearance agreement between Canada and the US, and we were working towards Beyond the Border 2.0, as it was affectionately called, a new 5-year plan, and then with elections on both sides of the border, that got stalled. So that was the genesis of our coalition, which is why we focused on that. And that's not to say that we are going to preclude down the road potentially working with Mexico and the Mexican border as well. But you got to start somewhere, and there's only so many hours in a day. There's a bunch of other questions, but I don't know how much time we have to deal with those online during this call.
Yeah, I think we're going to go back to Lori to monitor some of those questions, but
okay.
I did want to say that all that we've discussed is why we need the Cascadia Innovation Corridor, and there are many, many challenges we're facing right now today that need solutions that can become international standards. And this is both a great challenge and a great opportunity. And I thank you both for clarifying all the challenges you're going through. Okay, back to you, Lori. Do you want to pick some of the questions that we've
Yeah, if we
put
can have
the other panelists up?
Join us as well. And again, I'm all the panelists up, and I think there's questions that will overlap a lot of different expertise. And if there's one from the audience that you really want to tackle, feel free to jump in. I've got one teed up here that has sort of been addressed, but I think it's worth bringing the point home again. So innovation sounds important, but policymakers in both countries are consumed right now by emergency responses, upcoming elections, a lot of, again, unprecedented events, or at least unprecedented in the scale that they're occurring in. So what are the ways that the Cascadia region can ensure that there are benefits that result from focusing on these border technologies versus other public investments? Solomon, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, and I think that also hits straight at the need for the culture that we have in the Cascadia region in terms of never really being satisfied with the status quo. I don't know what it is, whether it's just the fact that the Rockies are between us geographically and the respective political centers, or the water that we have, or the air we breathe. But I think the culture of innovation is one that has really been part of the storyline. But I think in order to really establish the mechanism to effect change, a lot of the files we're dealing with are not politically driven in terms of the nature of commercially proven off-the-shelf technology. We have this stuff sitting on our shelves in terms of the folks within the region that are either tech startups or using things from the medical field, moving them into transportation. So the ecosystem that we have in terms of the corridor that extends to different disciplines, I think that the need for the Cascadia Innovation Corridor to foster the kinds of things that you will get out of hackathons or other kind of solution-driven session, like what YVR and CTEC are pursuing. Those are aspects that we need to make sure that the story is told and supported and really depoliticize this as much as really getting into the real-time measurement of successes, as well as learning from failure, not being afraid of trying things out to be able to come up with a better solution down the line.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, I think part of the question was why should we be investing in this type of technology versus other other measures, health measures, etc. And I think one important point would be, which we've tried to make as a business case for our health preclearance pilot, is that both governments are spending billions of dollars in the U.S. more so, where they're providing billions of dollars in grants to airports and airlines, and rather than allowing the industry to sort of come back and recover on its own. So investing in this type of technology is a lot cheaper proposition, a better use of government funds, because it would cost less to do this versus continuing to bail out industry sectors that are impacted by COVID-19.
Julie, any comments from you?
No, I don't think I have anything to add. I think those were really good responses.
I think you made a good point earlier that I wanted to circle back to, in that I'm from university, so I always think the role of academia is important, but really understanding those best practices and having the data and having that fully accessible in an organized way is going to help with these efforts as well, because a lot of times we don't document our successes. We only see the failures that result. And now more than ever, I think it's important that we are sharing our best practices in these safety protocols and these innovations. So I have a question that's kind of a departure from the innovation topic, but it's been asked a couple times, and I think it is an interesting question because it kind of does get to a lot of the heart of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor, and it comes down to identity. So this person has asked, or he said, that Canadians overwhelmingly support keeping the US-Canada border closed. Has the Cascadia concept permeated to an extent that our British Columbian neighbors see us, and this must be an American posing the question, see us as Cascadians or Washingtonians first and not primarily as Americans? And I do think this is an interesting question, because I feel like this is maybe getting tested a little bit right now with what's going on with the border restrictions. So if anybody has thoughts on that, jump in. If not, we can move to a different question as well.
Sure, I'll make a couple of comments on it. Being on the Canadian side of the border, I mean, there is a sentiment that because of what's happened in the U.S. With flare-ups in different parts of the country, there is this concern and fear amongst the general public, including British Columbians, where we feel we have handled the outbreak very well in comparison to other jurisdictions. But this is why things like health preclearance and testing are so important, because that would go a long way, I believe, in reestablishing that confidence that, okay, people coming in are not going to be spreading the virus into our community, because we know they've been tested and are found to be negative. So that's why it's important to do that until we get to a vaccine and other measures that will make us all feel a lot safer.
And Lori, that's why these principles are so important, that we encourage both federal governments to adopt a clear set of principles for the easing of the restrictions.
So there was also a question specific to Portland Airport, and if someone could speak to if and how Portland Airport is participating in Cascadia-wide discussions about opening up travel with YDR or CTAC.
It's a great question. We'd be happy to reach out to them, but we haven't.
And we'd be happy to have them join our coalition and be part of our air border recovery task force, and absolutely.
Okay, is Chris Sands still with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
You're still here. Okay, great. Good to see your face back up here again.
You were hiding.
Well, it's not that good a face.
So we have just a few minutes left. for our discussion before we kind of close it up. I have a couple more questions, but if there is a lingering point from a panel discussion that anybody wants to address, now might be a good time to do that. No? Okay. So let's get back to innovation. So innovation at the border used to be really focused on wait times and minimizing long lineups. That's what a lot of the institute that I work has traditionally really looked at, or shortening up those queues. So this gets back a little bit to why should our region care about those technological investments versus other public priorities. And I guess I would like to hear somebody speak to the new sort of border innovation that we're talking about. Solomon, you touched on this a little bit in the beginning, and how we're not necessarily just talking about long lineups or long queues. We really are shifting to kind of this new way of looking at border management. And what might that feel like for the average Cascadia traveler going back and forth?
So I think when we first started with emergency response, we had an idea in terms of setting up new checkpoints. So whether that's a health screening type of apparatus that would be layered on top of the checks that are done federally. So I think as time has gone on, I think there's been a realization that in order to both achieve the efficiencies for what traffic there is, but also more importantly, what we're also trying to do is minimize the number of people in a square footage area, whether it's a land border crossing or airport or otherwise. So even that proximity, I think, is really part of the solution set that even necessitates, let's find the most efficient way possible and focused public investments in terms of being able to minimize risk. So I think from a traveler perspective, I think one should expect to have a lot more advanced information being put forward. So there are 75 separate forms in North America in circulation right now, from PDFs to smartphone apps to otherwise. We should expect that to be cleaned up a bit more in terms of simplifying that for the traveler. So that's number one. And number two, I think in terms of the actual process of crossing, the kind of information in terms of personal information, whether it's identity or health status, that becomes part of the new normal or new abnormal in terms of being able to get into that kind of routine that gets into a series of 5 questions that will deal with symptoms, where you've been, exposure levels that are really the trust in the individual traveler as well as the system overall that become part of the journey to go from point A to B.
I would just say the challenge I see is the border is a federal jurisdiction, but health verification is a local jurisdiction. It's state and local. And we have to be thinking about how to put these together for the future, long term.
But Matt, if I can jump on that, I think, Pinware very early on was a pioneer of the enhanced driver's license, and that was an experiment between driver's licenses, which are local, and the federal border control. So you've seen this work. You've found solutions at these problems before. I think that's the other thing to answer Lori's question that we have to expect. We're having this national debate in the U.S. about wearing masks, for goodness sakes. We're going to have some people who are skeptics, who don't want to play by the rules. At the same time, what we should have learned after 9/11, and I hope we still know, is that at one level the federal government wants to have total control. But what they eventually realized is that total control and restricting the border wasn't as important as domain awareness and having an ability to do risk management. So we, just like after 9/11, we went to total control as our gut response. We wanted to get a control of this pandemic and roll it back. And I think that's a natural first reaction. But part of what we're talking about, and part of what I think the Pacific Northwest could be central to, is moving towards creating the domain awareness that allows risk management, so we don't have to have an iron border, but we can actually have a more fluid one. And in the middle of that, and this is where the region, I think, has a huge role to play, we rely on individuals to step up and step forward and say, yes, I'll do the things I need to do and share the information I need to share to be a trusted traveler, to be able to cross the border. And Pacific Northwest responded to enhanced driver's licenses. They responded to the Peace Arch card. They responded to Nexus. They've really been willing to undertake some of those burdens in order to be able to have the border work. And for the entire border, we need willing volunteers. So this is the region where I think people can and will step up. They'll start showing that this can be done. And yeah, there are going to be the people who don't want to wear a mask or sitting skeptically on the sideline. But when they see how good it can be and that it's not really that inconvenient, they'll follow. And so you'll lead the way to getting us to a better border, I think.
Beautiful. Great comment, Chris. And thanks to Governor Gregoire for that amazing enhanced driver's license.
Yeah.
He put a lot of effort into that.
That's right. And one quick thing to add, this is such a unique moment in time because we're not just dealing with people trying to get between our two countries, but even trying to go to other states. And the types of feedback that we're getting about, I'm so confused. I'm trying to go to New York. I'm trying to go to Alaska. What do I need to do? And so is there a moment where there can be a little bit more standardization? It feels like this could be that with the confusion that there is right now. This notion of crossing a border is not just a US-Canada phenomenon. So maybe there's a moment to seize on with that.
Well, thanks everyone. I'm thrilled that we were able to end on an optimistic note because I wasn't sure we were going to be able to get there. But I'm going to turn it over to Matt to transition to the final closing comments from Greg.
Yeah, thank you very much, Matt. Laurie, I just wanted to introduce Greg, our co-chair of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor from the Business Council of BC, to give us some closing comments. I think this has been a great webinar, and I hope that we can work together with the other working groups of the Cascadia Innovation Corridor to solve some of these sticky wickets and come up with some real solutions for the nation and for North America. So thank you so much, Greg, and thank you, Governor Gregoire, for initiating this series. And I hope everyone on the call and on the webinar will tune in to the other series that are coming up. So over to you, Greg. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Matt, so much. And thanks to all the presenters for their informed and imaginative insights. I took copious notes today. It's amazing the actions and the thinking of how to get the border moving comprehensively again in a safe manner, but also driving some really future forward and creative approaches that are going to grow the region and ensure the safe and efficient mobility of people and capital and goods and data and innovative capacity. I know in particular, Governor Gregoire and I want to thank Laurie and Matt, not just for moderating today's session, but for acting as co-chairs in their leadership as we continue to drive the Cascadia Innovation Steering Group and fundamentally the ecosystem we're creating. I want to thank also the Challenge Seattle team, Kylie, and our team here at the Business Council for helping put this together today. You know, as we heard, Cascadia Innovation Corridor and the ongoing cross-border collaboration is recognized, and it's a growing ecosystem. We see it every day. And we can leverage this for economic recovery, but also mitigate the risk and open opportunity for the entire region, as we heard today. As Governor Gregoire stated at the outset, we've got a really rich and diverse connected relationship personally and environmentally and economically and historically, and it's something we can draw on from the past, but really propel us going forward into the future. I know in BC, we instinctively look south and west before we look east, and those relationships are really going to matter in the days and weeks ahead as we live and work and invest in what Laurie called the new abnormalcy, I think was the term she used. So while we've got some immediate and significant challenges to our health personally and economically during COVID, what I took away from today is that these challenges can be impacted positively through collaboration, whether it's in technology and digital data aggregation, visualization, or new approaches in life sciences, travel, and managing and protecting our personal health. But I think the solutions that we can create together are really going to inform not just the region, but I think could be a real example to the rest of North America and the world. And so that's really the vision that we've got going forward. How can we improve the region as a sustainable mega region, but fundamentally have an impact globally in ways that we're not even thinking about? But what we're also faced with, as we know every day, where COVID has exposed those cracks and inherent weaknesses in our respective societies and systems. As we rebuild towards renewed confidence as the consumer, it's going to be important we work together more than ever. I noted the opportunity of what Chris talked about, which is the potential for regional level solutions that work for the Pacific Northwest, and how we can actually figure it out on the intricacies of a particular region rather than look at writ large at a nation or an international level. So despite the border being closed, as we know, commerce continues to move back and forth, but also we've got shared experiences and the sad reminder of our connectedness through the forest fires we're all living through, that are currently burning in Washington State, BC, and Oregon. And it reminds of us that we really are doing this work together to support people and communities for a better quality of life. And I know in BC, we're watching with anguish, and our hearts go out to the people in Washington State that have lost loved ones, and that entire communities have been impacted personally. And so I think it's more important than ever that we work together, not just as a result of devastating forest fires, but how we can get through this in the days, weeks, and months to come. But those challenges also present opportunity, and speaks to how we have a common purpose. As you know, our post-secondary institutions started working jointly on long-term research solutions to address ongoing challenges associated with wildfires. And that was before the experiences we've had in the last several weeks. But it's a metaphor really for what I've learned through COVID, that we can accomplish a lot for good when we're working collaboratively with common purpose at speed towards common outcomes. And inherent in this collaboration, as you see in the Cascadia Corridor, is the ability to commute and build on trust and find common interest and shared knowledge and act on those two pieces. And the one example for me is that Chris Gregoire really epitomized what we're talking about, what we're building. You know, late February, she reached out to me and was sharing what Washington State was doing at the outset of the pandemic. Her regular updates on the learnings, real time, and information she shared materially helped us here at the Business Council, but business leaders and employers and governments and communities. And I just want to acknowledge Chris again for leadership and friendship and continued trust. But I know that those relationships exist on this call today and throughout the corridor itself. And I really look forward on building on it through the work we're doing together and building out the ecosystem in a sustainable mega region going forward. To build on that, as Chris said at the outset, we've got a number of these webinars coming up through the next several weeks, and I just want to put them in your calendar as we speak today. Registration details are available at connectcascadia.com. That's connectcascadia.com, and we're going to share those with you via email in the coming days. But if you want to mark your calendar, October 9th, we're going to have a conversation about developing solutions that support a connected and livable region. And it's going to be hosted by Kevin Desmond, the CEO of TransLink, which is our Greater Vancouver transit provider, and Paula Hammond. Many of you know the energetic former Washington State Secretary of Transportation. And both of them co-chair the Cascadia Subcommittee on Housing, Transportation, and Connectivity. On October 27th, we're going to talk about local farms, COVID-19, the future of sustainability. That's going to be hosted by Dr. Ricky Yatta, the Dean of UBC Faculty of Land and Food Systems, and another one of the co-chairs of our Cascadia Subcommittee on Sustainable Ag. And November 18th, we've got a really interesting conversation, germane, not just to today, but going forward. We talked a little bit about therapeutic development in this conversation today. It's Life Sciences in Cascadia, that's co-hosted by Dr. David Grossman, the National Senior Medical Director for Community Health at Kaiser Permanente, and Dr. Leslie Eisford, the life sciences industry expert from British Columbia, that co-chair our subcommittee on life sciences. So next week, we look forward to releasing a report we've been preparing with the Boston Consulting Group with details of how the Cascadia Innovation Corridor can serve a global model for sustainable growth for the next 30 years, particularly in the areas of housing, transportation, and environmental stewardship. The report will include a series of strategies and new recommendations to develop a mega region that embraces economic success while providing inclusive livability. And in that context, we have the opportunity to share the report directly with all of you next week and with the public. So thanks again for taking the time to participate in today's conversation. Thanks for our speakers and Lori and Matt for bringing us together. Just fantastic insights. Solomon, Chris, Jerry, and Julie for sharing your knowledge and expertise in the work you're doing. And on behalf of all of us, thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for joining us today. Have a great Tuesday, and we look forward to seeing you soon.